Good afternoon again. So now your stomachs are nice and full and you're ready for the rest of our program. Before I introduce our panel, I want to talk just briefly about some of the ways that we're working to make State of Black America and our Equality Index with its analysis of metropolitan level data and more understandable, more relevant, more useful, and hopefully even a little exciting to you. The State of Black America web series, which you saw promoted, features 6 dynamic panels of thought leaders, policymakers, and activists discussing the state of Black America as it relates to our cities, our Black men and women, our history, and the work still before us as we develop an agenda for the future. The wonderful infographics that you will see or are seeing are a new element that we are using successfully to socialize our content and messaging for today's media and a new generation. And these were developed for us through the pro bono services of our friends at Weber Shandwick, and I want to recognize Henry Stewart, who's a vice president there. I invite you to view the content on NUL.org and on Interactive One websites, and you can share with your social media friends and followers using the hashtag #JobsForAll. The topics and trends highlighted in the infographics and web series are a great way to introduce our panel. We are joined by a not shy or retiring, but very thoughtful, dynamic, opinionated group of thought leaders. So I know we're going to have an exciting discussion. Our moderator is joining us for the 2nd year in a row to help us to launch the State of Black America. Karen Finney is the host of MSNBC's Disrupt with Karen Finney. We are delighted to share this important event with her, and I'm going to invite her to the platform to introduce the rest of the panelists. So let's give her an applause.
Okay, so not shy or retiring. No pressure there. You hear that, fellas? Well, it's my honor to introduce this panel. I will start with Jonathan Capehart. He is a member of the Washington Post editorial board. He writes about politics and social issues for the Post Partisan blog. He is also an MSNBC contributor. Jamal Simmons is co-chairman of the International Innovation Alliance. He's one of the most experienced communications professionals of his generation, and he is at the Rabin Group consulting firm. Okay, so here. Jonathan, see, I had it right. Jonathan Capehart. Juan Williams. God, gotta do everything for these guys. Juan Williams is with the Fox News Channel, and he started in '97 as a contributor and co-host of Fox News Channel's The Five, where he's one of 7 rotating Fox personalities. Additionally, he serves as Fox News Channel's political analyst, and he is a regular panelist on Fox News Sunday, one of the saner voices, I might say, and also special report with Bret Baier, and he is a regular substitute host for The O'Reilly Factor. And last but not least, Thomas Shapiro, PhD. Dr. Thomas Shapiro directs the Institute on Assets and Social Policy, and he is the Pockross Professor of Law and Social Policy at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. In February of this year, he co-authored a groundbreaking study, The Roots of the Widening Racial Wealth Gap, explaining the black-white economic divide, which statistically validates the fundamental factors that together largely explain why white households accumulate wealth much faster over time than African American households, and that's certainly something we're going to want to talk about. So this is our panel. So I'm going to start with a question to the panel, and I think I will just essentially start with at the end and ask everyone to comment. And one of the things in the report obviously details this growing inequality, the gap. And the question is, we've come together, the report does an incredible job of highlighting and showing us where those issues are. But the question that I have for this panel is, what are some of the institutional factors and the things that contribute to the persistence of this gap and the widening of this gap? And I'll give one example. One of the things we've heard the President and Secretary Duncan talk about recently is school discipline, reform of school discipline. We know that African American children are more likely to be disciplined at a younger age. When you're disciplined, you're suspended. When you're suspended, that's time off from class. When you're out of class, you're missing school time. Then you're also labeled. Then you're also, in terms of the school to prison pipeline, you're more likely to get pushed in that direction. That to me that's an institutional problem that needs a solution that adds to some of these gaps. So I'd love to hear from the panel about sort of other thoughts on some of these more institutional factors we need to be dealing with.
Great, I would love to start. Thank you. Let me lift up one of the pieces of data in the great report, and it's the data that one of the ones I'm most interested in that looks at, compares median wealth of white and African American families, median half above, half below. And the data in the report tell us that the average African American family in wealth, what you own minus what you could sell, owns about 6 cents for every dollar of wealth that the average white family has. That's about $6,300 to $110,000. That's the 6 cents on a dollar. And I just wanted to break that down a little bit because the numbers sometimes don't really tell a story. So I like to think of this in terms of what I would call asset poverty. If a family did not have a stream of income and had to live off of its savings or stocks and bonds, to survive at the meager, woefully inadequate government poverty line of about $2,000 a month for a family of four, the average African American family barely survives 3 months. That's how fragile and how close to the cliff families of color are in the United States. In contrast, that average white family can sustain itself for about 4.5 years. And so that's where we want to start to think about the conversation of where we've come and what the gap looks like. And maybe a little later, I would love to have the opportunity to talk about some of the policies that actually make that gap as wide as it is.
Okay, Jamal?
Great, thank you for having me. We spend a lot of time at the Internet Innovation Alliance focusing on broadband access. It's making sure that young people have access and people in rural communities, urban communities have access to broadband and the highest speeds possible. So the institutional place I'll start is at schools. In 1996, about 14% of our schools were connected to the Internet. These days, about 95%, according to SEC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel. About 95% of schools are connected to the Internet. The problem, though, is the speeds are far too slow. The speeds are so slow that for most of the time, you can't have an entire classroom of kids online at the same time doing work. So that's something that we have to fix. And what we saw recently is the president has a program to fix that. It's called Connect Ed. And the Connect Ed project is going to spend about $200 million to change how we fund getting schools wired, to make them faster. We see another $750 million going to be spent by corporate actors to try to add on top of that for equipment and training. But we've got to make sure that the teachers, not only do they have the equipment, not only do they have the speed, but we need teachers to be educated and equipped to be able to help the kids know what to do with that stuff once it shows up in the classroom.
So, but Jamal, can I just follow up with you really quickly? Because what about in the home? I mean, we hear a lot about, and there are a lot of great statistics about African Americans on social media, right? We all have our devices, but that's not the same thing as having a computer in the home where you're actually able to use that as a tool for education.
Absolutely, and getting low-cost computers is important, but also making sure that homes are wired and that people have the ability to get those fast speeds at home. And there are a lot of programs out there, a lot of policies looking now at how do we do that. The FCC is focused on it. You saw right now there's IP trials that they're starting to see whether or not how we transition away from having the regular old phone service that most of us know about to getting to that high-speed phone service. So they're going to do trials in Alabama and Florida to determine whether or not people still get 911 access, senior citizens are still able to use it, all the different issues that may arise. But we are seeing consumers move away from having just regular old house phone service to getting their phone service through cable or through Skype or all these other ways that people are accessing the web.
Juan?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think I come at this from the perspective of thinking about children and how young people prepare themselves for the world of work and how they get the opportunity to have a job. And what we can see right away is high poverty rates directly impacting children, but particularly black children, Overall right now you have a poverty rate for children of about 22%, but when it comes to black children, you're talking about 38%, Latino kids 35%. And you see, Karen was just talking about suspension rates, but you can see right away consequences that poverty has in terms of preparing a child to go to school, to learn, and then be prepared for opportunities. So when we think about that, I come back to the idea that this Urban League is so much to me at the heart and soul of what needs to be done in terms of this jobs rebuild project, because when I think about what the Urban League is about, it is a do tank. I think that's what Mark Morial said, a do tank. You guys are doing stuff. You guys are out there helping people. And I think the idea that you help people with job training in specific, that you help people to understand what it is to be an entrepreneur, that you help people to develop the networks necessary, are all part of educating that young person, I would even say that child, so that they can have that job. So as we have conversations about the direct challenge you face, whether it is the minimum wage that we heard discussed earlier, and I think it's such an important issue right now, but also as we think about education and how critical the crisis in education in this country is to what you are doing at the Urban League, that when you have to do remedial work to get somebody ready to understand and participate in job training, you're already operating at a deficit. And you really need people to come to you who can appreciate what you have to offer. Because what you're doing is so critically important, but yet, oftentimes, you're facing a difficult situation with difficult clientele that's come to you with so many deficits. So I come back to the need for education reform. I come back to the need for strong families in such a critical way at this point.
So I'm going to follow up with you on that real quick, Juan, because when we talk about children, we talk about families and education and making sure children are prepared. Doesn't, along with that, go the policies like increasing the minimum wage, like paid sick leave, the kinds of things that help support families and help support parents be better parents to their children?
I don't think there's any question. I was just so taken by Secretary Fox's analysis that, it's about, are there jobs in the neighborhood? Or how many trains, cars, buses do you have to take to get to the job? What does that do in terms of taking you away from family, Karen, away from children, opportunities? What does it mean in terms of paying for childcare? All of this is part of a larger structure. The question is, in the absence of so many of these critical elements, what are you saying at the Urban League to people that you are serving, that you're trying to say, help get a job, hold a job, perform well in that job so they can grow? And at times, rather than simply lamenting the absence of these elements, we have to find a way to compensate, because I think that's what all of you are doing, those of you who are in the Urban League movement. As doers, you're finding ways to make it work for people. And you can't wait on the Congress all the time. So I'm just trying to approach it from a practical, can-do Urban League standpoint.
Got it. Mr. Capehart.
I guess I'll go the utopian route then, rather than practical. Sort of, I guess to answer your question, it's sort of where to begin. Everyone here at the table so far has zeroed in on many of the institutional factors contributing to the gap. And so I want to focus in on My Brother's Keeper, the president's initiative, because what he's trying to do is get at a lot of these things that we're talking about and trying to get to them and get to African American men, but they can also be applied to African American children altogether, to help them and help all of us break, whether it's the school to prison pipeline, all these other things that hold our children back. The interesting thing here is we have a president of the United States and an attorney general of the United States who are pushing these things. And I think the challenge is going to be, on top of all of the challenges there are to closing this gap, to breaking some of the institutional constraints there are to closing the gap and to improving lives. It's that once those two men are out of office, how do you sustain that effort? And so while you all here at the Urban League are doing things, I do think it is terrific from my perspective to have the leader of the free world not only take this on as an issue, but to take it on as an issue, make it extremely important, ceremony at the White House. But the other important thing is this is something that he can and will do once he's no longer president. And that, I think, will help with sustaining it. But again, if you don't have leadership from the White House, and you certainly don't have any leadership from Congress, then it's going to be incumbent upon the Urban League and other groups trying to fight these things to keep fighting the fight.
Dr. Shapiro, I want to follow up with you quickly, and then I'm going to move on to a different question. But I would love to have you talk a little about in terms of the asset gap and in terms of, from a public policy standpoint, some of the things that, because this idea of, and Jonathan and I were joking about, the difference between being rich and being wealthy, right? And so how do we, and this is an area where continuously the report has shown African Americans and people of color in general are lagging behind, as you were also pointing out.
Sure. So we've been looking at the racial wealth gap since 1984, and in a recent report, we looked at it over the last 25 years in a study that followed the same set of families as they walked through American life, institutions, schools, and work. The gap in 1984 opens up, and these are constant dollars, at $85,000. And that's tragic enough. By 2009, that gap had nearly tripled to $235,000. So what we were really interested in doing was to deconstruct that growth in the racial wealth gap over the last 25 years and to see what was the main drivers of it are. With a gap that large, everything you can think of is going to have some causative effect. But if you're really serious, then you want to grab the largest things first. And by far, home ownership accounts for about 27% of the growth in that gap over the last 25 years. And for me, when I think about wealth and the racial wealth gap, the institutional intersections and policies, and tax policy specifically, around home ownership is the core. There are a lot of policies we have, and I will just mention one. There are a lot of policies we have that actively extend inequality. The mortgage interest deduction is a prime case. I was real interested to hear Secretary Fox talk about, we're talking about $300 billion over the next 10 years for transportation. The next 6 years, the mortgage interest deduction tax expenditures amount to $2.2 trillion, 70% of which go to the top wealthiest 5%. Right. That's a way in which policy embedded in our tax code positively extends inequality, has helped create it, and grows it into the future. So as I think about policy and institutions, I have to think about the home ownership area, which is where most Americans accumulate their wealth, and to think about all the policies and intersections that provide that structure.
And I would just mention here, the sad reality of the recession and what it did to so many people in the black community who had taken advantage of new programs actually put in place by Presidents Clinton and Presidents Bush to buy their own home. But because there was such a housing bubble and such a foreclosure crisis, many of those families lost their homes and lost that opportunity for wealth that you're referring to.
I want to switch gears, and Jonathan, I'm going to start with you on this question. One of the other things I noticed in the report that as an improvement was the Civic Engagement Index, and that incorporated 2012 in the election and both voter participation, voter registration. But one of the things that strikes me is that in 2012, in addition to having President Obama at the top of the ticket, you also had voter suppression tactics, which I think actually served as a catalyst because people were so angry that it served as a catalyst for people to get out and vote. What is that catalyst going to be in 2014? Because we know African Americans, people of color, we tend to be the worst in terms of midterm voter turnout, and yet, as we know, those are some of the most important elections.
I think a couple of things. One, President Obama is not on the ballot, but President Obama is on the ballot. In the midterm elections, Republicans are going to be running on Obamacare, 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 and hatred of the president. Also relying on the fact that, as Karen said, African Americans, Latinos, people of color, young people, we stay home during the midterm election, thus giving Republicans the advantage that they have during the midterm election to try to retake the Senate, hold on to the House. But something interesting happened in Virginia last year when they had to do the special election, or when they had to do the election that made Terry McAuliffe governor. A lot of people thought, excuse me, because it was an off-year election, not a presidential election, that, well, one, Terry McAuliffe wouldn't win because, well, he's Terry McAuliffe. But also Terry McAuliffe wouldn't win because African Americans just would not come out and vote. It was clear that Terry McAuliffe would need to have the African American vote come out in order for him to win. But the conventional wisdom was, president's not on the ballot, it's not a presidential election year, African Americans won't come out to vote in the same numbers that they did during the presidential election year. So, what was that guy's name? Cuccinelli?
Yeah.
So Cuccinelli would slide on in there and become governor. Well, guess what happened? Not only did African Americans come out to vote, they came out to vote in the same proportion for that gubernatorial election that they did in 2012 for the presidential election. And when you really look, you boil the numbers down, who were the voters who made Terry McAuliffe Governor McAuliffe? African American women. And so what I've been meaning to do, what I've been meaning to write for the longest time and keep writing it every week until we get to the midterm elections, it's that African Americans, if you haven't learned in 2008 and you haven't learned in 2012 or with Governor McAuliffe's election in 2013, you decide elections when you show up. And so with voter suppression efforts, African Americans got really ticked off, when those state legislatures actively said, no, you can't vote. And folks who probably wouldn't have voted said, oh, hell no, I'm gonna go vote. And they stood in line for hours. That has to be the mindset now. Because again, President Obama is not on the ballot, but President Obama is on the ballot.
Juan, I'm going to ask you to answer the same question, but I want to just add something to what Jonathan said, and that is part of what made the difference. And I know this, having been at the National Party in Terry's election. I wasn't there for his election, but having served in the National Party, is spending the money to turn out the African American vote. Because too oftentimes I think that the expectation is, well, who else are you going to vote for? Of course they're going to turn out for the Democrat.
Well, the consequence is then it's not that they fail to vote for the Democrats, that they don't show up at the polls. And that's part of the equation, and that's what we've seen. There is a tremendous difference in midterm electorates and presidential year electorates. And the key difference has to do with not only income, given what we're talking about here today, but also has to do with race, with age, and the skew in midterms tends to be older, whiter, wealthier, conservative voters. That's why you got that wave, that 63 plus GOP congressional seat addition in 2010. This time around, it's almost like I'd like to ask Karen this question because she's such a good Politico. But I would say to you, in the Urban League movement, yesterday I think it was yesterday or the day before, Paul Ryan, the congressman from Wisconsin who's head of the House Budget Committee, put forward a budget that it seemed to me tailor-made to get that younger, minority, less affluent crowd to the polls. Why do I say that? Because in the Ryan budget, he says he wants to kill Obamacare, which is, I think, a key element of people who being able to care for their families. Medical care, very expensive item. But secondly, wants to cut taxes on the rich, would raise taxes on middle-income families. In addition to which, given what we heard from Secretary Fox today, cut spending on infrastructure projects. So what we're seeing is an effort by the party, the Republican Party, that I think is not in the interest of those younger, minority, less affluent voters. And ultimately, voting has to be about your self-interest. So somebody has to say to you concretely, here's what you are allowing to happen if you don't go to the polls and exercise your franchise. I've written histories about the civil rights movement, and I always say to people, it's such a history about black folks struggling for the right to vote. I don't think it really moves them, is what I've learned at this age. But I'm hoping that self-interest would dictate that people understand I can help myself. I can actually put dollars in my pocket. I can allow Anthony Fox and President Obama to get the spending that's necessary for the transportation bill. I can help the jobs bill to go forward in terms of my vote. These are the kinds of very direct messages that I think, again, I'd like to hear Karen, but you'd expect to see from Democrats in terms of their messaging, in terms of their advertising come this fall. Congressman Ryan recently had a controversy in which he spoke about poverty issues in terms of inner city culture. And he was widely criticized for using kind of code language talking about black culture. Well, you know what? Nobody's saying that Ryan is, crazy or off there. I'm certainly not saying that he's racist. But I think that you have to make the point, and again, this is a point that you and the Urban League movement are just so, perfectly positioned to make, that poverty is not just in the inner city and not just in the black community, that we're talking about not only Latinos, we're talking about whites, we're talking about suburbanites, we're talking about people in rural America. In fact, that's the majority of the poverty.
Right.
And I think that's an important part of changing this conversation, not laying down and being politically ineffectual or not saying, oh gosh, there's some election in November, but understanding it's in our interest to get out and vote.
So, Jamal, since I'm moderating and I'm giving my opinion, and you are in the business of giving a political and communications opinion, we were running a little bit tight on time, but I want to both have you and Dr. Shapiro weigh in on this in terms of, and I guess I think about it specifically too, in terms of the youth vote. I mean, that was also so critical to President Obama. I feel like women were, I think we'll get there. Yeah. So we got to get, but young people, I think in particular, and I'm curious if you have thoughts about, because I know you've worked on this technology in terms of being a catalyst to getting more people out to vote to see what their self-interests are.
Absolutely. The thing, I get the great fortune, although not always from my wallet, of meeting a lot of candidates because they usually are asking for money. But one of the things that I tell them is that Barack Obama is not going to save you. Barack Obama is not going to turn out voters for you. You need to have a relationship with your voters that's very direct. Laverne Chatman was here earlier, who's running for Congress in Northern Virginia. She is out there every day shaking hands with people. You've got to get out and meet them. And as Juan just said a second ago, you've got to give them something to vote for. I remember at one point we were doing campaigns, and I remember a flyer, this is probably 10 or 15 years ago, it said something like, Rosa Parks sat down so you could stand up. It's like, well, who is that for? Like my niece barely knows who Bill Clinton is. She thinks he's Hillary Clinton's husband.
Smart girl.
Exactly. But so you gotta, and then I think, as Juan also said, we gotta make this an election that's a choice and not just a referendum on the president. And the Republicans are invested in making this a referendum on Barack Obama's leadership, and we have got to tell them, Democrats and people who want to elect Democrats, have got to tell them what the alternative really is, so they understand what the choice is in the election. And so there's a little bit we have to do on the merits, but then there's more we have to sort of do on talking about the politics here of who these other folks are, and really getting young people to think about what's in their self-interest.
Great, so I get the last word.
Yeah.
So I'm a great believer in constituencies, and I'm a great believer in policies that are framed and messaged and that actually serve the interest of constituencies, and those constituencies will show up. And I think in terms of young adults and youth, there are three sets of policies, if you will, that revolve around getting students to college in a way that they can complete it without coming out with a millstone of debt around their neck. I think student debt reduction needs to be on the table in a very robust way. Thank you. I think... All right, I'm 1 for 1. Pell Grants need to have kept pace, so they actually finance college in a way that they were intended to, in a much more robust way. And then third, I would throw in, if you will, something that really is percolating in cities and its states, something called K-2C in San Francisco. The state of Nevada has implemented a universal policy for all newborns. The state of Maine is doing it for every single newborn in their state. The state of Nevada has taken it up. Cuyahoga County in Ohio is starting children's savings accounts as a way to inspire youth that college is actually, or post-secondary education, an eye-level opportunity, something in front of them that can be theirs and can help change behavior along the way. And that's something, those policies are on the ground. They need to be taken, in my estimation, to scale and national.
All right, thank you. I want to thank our panel. I know we're running short on time. We were going to try to do questions. Unfortunately, we are short on time. I've been asked to open it up to the members of the media who are here if they have any questions. Otherwise, we are going to wrap.
Well, let me just make a quick point that we were
Okay.
talking, that
You count. You're a member of the media. You count.
Professor Shapiro was saying one of the things that's so important is educating that child and things like internet access. And I know one of the sponsors of this event is Comcast, and my son's here. He works for Comcast, and he helps with something called Internet Essentials, which is a program to bring those computers into homes. I just think you should exploit my son. That's what I think.
Wow, you heard it here. And did you want to give out his phone number or email address?
No, I gotta keep the girls away.
Well, I want to thank our distinguished panel, Dr. Shapiro, Jamal Simmons, Juan Williams, and Jonathan Capehart. Thanks for a great discussion.
Everyone, for those who are attending the agency meetings, Department of Education and Department of Housing and Urban Development, please quickly gather your things and move to the buses. They're taking off at 3 promptly. Thank you for the wonderful program, and thanks again to AT&T for sponsoring.